Priya Anand had one objective: marry someone her mother would never, under any circumstances, approve of, and walk away in 6 months with her life finally her own. She found him building a bookshelf in a community center on Dundas West. He drove a truck with paint stains on the tailgate. He packed his daughter's lunch every morning in a metal container with a dented lid. He never once tried to impress anyone. She had no idea what she had just walked into. The Anand name carried a particular kind of gravity in Toronto, the kind that didn't need to announce itself because every door it approached was already open. Priya had grown up behind those doors. Private schools where the uniforms cost more than some families' grocery bills for a month. Fundraising galas at the Royal Ontario Museum where women wore silk and said things they didn't mean with immaculate pronunciation. Dinners at restaurants on King Street where a bottle of wine could cover someone's rent, and the conversation was just negotiation dressed in better lighting. She had learned early that in her mother's world, everything served a function. Every relationship was architecture. Every gesture was load-bearing, including Priya. Especially Priya. Vivian Anand was not a cruel woman. That was the part that made everything harder. She was a woman who had arrived in Canada from Hyderabad at 22, with a degree no one here recognized and a willingness to outlast every room she entered. She had built Anand Capital from a single commercial property in Scarborough into a development firm that now held interests across the GTA and into Hamilton and Kitchener. She had done this through discipline, strategic ruthlessness, and the absolute conviction that she knew what was best for the people she loved. Vivian loved her daughter. Priya had never questioned that. But Vivian's love came with blueprints, approved timelines, and no tolerance for improvisation. The plan Vivian had constructed for Priya's 32nd year was, by her mother's standards, a gift, a merger, not just of portfolios, but of families. The Whitfield Group held 4 decades of commercial real estate influence in Ontario, and a son named Connor who had an MBA from Rotman, adequate conversation skills, and the approximate emotional depth of a firm handshake. Vivian had been cultivating this alliance for 3 years. In her mind, the engagement was already a settled matter. All that remained was for Priya to confirm what had been decided on her behalf. Priya had 8 weeks before the Whitfield announcement dinner, 8 weeks before her life became a press release. She had smiled through the preliminary meetings. She had worn the right dress to the right restaurant on Bay Street and asked Connor the right questions and laughed at the right moments. She was excellent at all of it. That was the problem. She was so accomplished at performing the life her mother had designed that she had nearly forgotten she was performing. Nearly. The community center on Dundas West was not an Anand Capital property. It was a small building Priya managed as part of a neighborhood investment initiative, one of the few projects she had claimed as genuinely her own. A renovation of an old Portuguese social club into a space for after-school programs and ESL classes. She was there on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, reviewing contractor bids at a folding table in the main hall, when the back wall's shelving unit gave way with a crack that sounded like a branch breaking and sent 200 pounds of donated books cascading across the floor. The building coordinator called a handyman service. Priya moved her laptop and waited. The man who arrived 40 minutes later was not what she had expected, though she could not have said what she had expected. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, and moved with the unhurried ease of someone who had stopped needing to prove anything a long time ago. He wore a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and carried a toolbox that looked like it had seen 20 years of steady use. He assessed the damage, measured the wall, and began working without unnecessary conversation. He simply worked. Priya answered 3 emails. She was halfway through a 4th when the front door opened and a girl appeared, 7 years old, wearing a backpack too large for her frame and holding a sketchbook that required both hands. She had her father's eyes and an expression of absolute seriousness. The girl surveyed the books on the floor, then looked at Priya with the direct, unself-conscious attention that only children and people with nothing to hide can manage. "Did it fall?" she asked her father. "It did," Tobias Henning said without looking up. The girl turned to Priya. "Why do shelves always break from the middle?" "Structural weakness," Priya said. "The weight distributes unevenly." "But the books on the ends are heavier," the girl said. She pointed. "Those ones are encyclopedias." Priya looked at her. Something shifted in her chest. Small and unexpected, not quite a laugh, but the beginning of one. She sat down on one of the plastic chairs and explained, in honest terms, how load distribution works, how a shelf bows under stress at its longest unsupported span, regardless of where the heaviest objects sit. The girl, whose name Priya would learn was Wren, listened with complete seriousness, her chin tilted up, the sketchbook balanced on her knees. Her father kept working. The books stayed on the floor. It was the most genuine conversation Priya had had in 8 weeks. Tuned. What she noticed about Tobias Henning in the hour that followed was not his appearance or his quiet, though she noticed both. What she noticed was that he did not perform for her. He was not diminished by her presence, not inflated by it. He occupied his space without calibrating himself to her the way most people did when they realized who she was. At some point he had looked up and she had introduced herself, full name, reflexive habit, and something had moved briefly behind his eyes. A flicker of recognition, there and gone. He had nodded, said it was nice to meet her, and returned to the wall. She told herself it was nothing. What she did not know, and would not know until much later, was that Tobias Henning had seen the work order for this building 2 weeks earlier and had taken the job himself. He had known whose project it was. He had been watching Anand Capital's acquisition patterns in the West End for months, and he had wanted to see the property firsthand. He had not expected to meet Priya Anand in person. He had not expected, when he did, to find someone who would sit on a plastic chair and explain structural engineering to a 7-year-old, with genuine patience and no audience to perform for. That detail he kept to himself. Priya did not give him her card. She did not ask for his. She went back to her laptop, and he finished the repair and took Wren home. That should have been the end of it. It would have been, except that the following Saturday, Vivian Anand hosted a private dinner at the family home in Forest Hill, a gathering that was technically casual and would in practice function as the formal introduction between Priya and Connor Whitfield in the presence of both families. Priya sat through 5 courses. At no point during that evening did anyone ask her what she wanted. On the drive home, she sat in the back seat with the city lights sliding past the window, and a specific kind of clarity settling over her. The kind that arrives not when you decide something, but when you finally admit you decided it weeks ago. She called the Handyman service Monday morning and asked if Tobias Henning was available for a consultation on a separate matter. Tobias arrived at her office near Queen and Spadina at 11 on a Wednesday. He was wearing the same kind of work clothes, carrying coffee in a paper cup, and he looked at her across the lobby with an expression that suggested he understood. This was not about a bookshelf. They sat in a small meeting room on the 3rd floor. Priya laid out the terms the way she approached every difficult conversation. Clearly, without sentiment, fair by any reasonable standard. She needed a marriage. Specifically, she needed a marriage her mother could not absorb into her plans. One that was real enough to hold up legally but built on terms both parties understood from the start. She needed a man who represented everything Vivian Anand's world would refuse to accommodate. Not out of cruelty, out of calculation. The marriage would last 6 months and end with a divorce neither of them would contest. In exchange, Tobias would receive financial compensation sufficient to secure Wren's education, housing, and stability. She said all of this without apology because she believed in being honest about what she was asking. Tobias sat across from her and said nothing for long enough that she began to wonder whether she had miscalculated entirely. He was not offended. She could see that. He was thinking. Not about the money. He was thinking about her, about what she was actually doing and what it said about the situation she was trapped in. When he spoke, his voice was even. Wren doesn't find out it's a contract. Priya had prepared for negotiation about terms, compensation, timeline. She had not expected that to be the only condition. "Agreed," she said. He nodded once. The meeting lasted 12 more minutes. By the end of it, they had the framework of an arrangement that would, within 72 hours, become a legal marriage. They married on a Thursday afternoon at Toronto City Hall, with 2 witnesses recruited from the hallway and offered $40 each for their trouble. Priya wore a gray blazer she had chosen specifically because it was not a wedding blazer. Tobias wore a dark jacket over a plain shirt and held the door for her, going in and coming out. When the officiant pronounced them married, he looked at Priya with an expression she could not fully read. Not cold, not warm, just present. Outside on the sidewalk, the late September wind came off the lake, and Priya pulled her coat closed. She had done it. The machine was broken. Vivian would receive the news before sundown. The Whitfield engagement was finished. She should have felt relief. She did feel relief, but standing on that sidewalk with the ring still unfamiliar on her finger, and the man beside her watching the street with a stillness that seemed to come from somewhere deep and long established, she also felt something else. The distinct awareness that she had made a very large move in a game she did not fully understand. Tobias turned. Trucks around the corner. Ren gets out at 3:15. The house was on a tree-lined street in Roncesvalles, a narrow brick semi-detached with a green door and a front porch, where someone had left a pair of small rubber boots beside a potted fern doing its best against the coming autumn. Priya had driven past neighborhoods like this her entire life without really seeing them. Now, she was carrying a single suitcase up the front steps while Tobias unlocked the door and Ren watched from the porch with an expression of careful neutrality. "Your room's at the end of the hall," Tobias said. "Second door on the left." He said it the way someone describes a room in a house, not the way someone welcomes a person into their life. The room was small and clean. A window facing the backyard. A dresser with empty drawers. A quilt on the bed that looked handmade and old, the kind of object that implied a history she had not asked about. She set her suitcase on the floor and stood in the doorway and tried to identify what she was feeling. Not regret, something more precise. The specific vertigo of a person who has made an irreversible decision and is only now beginning to understand what irreversible means. The first week was a study in contrast. Not the contrast she had prepared for. She had braced herself for visible markers of financial strain and found, instead, that Tobias's life was organized around different priorities. The fridge was full. The floors were clean. Ren had a shelf of books that required a step stool to reach the top row and a desk where she did her homework every evening with focused, self-directed diligence. The house was not spare because they lacked resources. It was spare because someone had made deliberate choices about what mattered. Tobias cooked dinner most nights. Real meals, not elaborate, but made from actual ingredients with actual attention. He drove Ren to school in the truck that had seen better years. He took phone calls in the kitchen standing up and in the backyard when they required more privacy. And twice in the first week, Priya noticed him step outside mid-sentence, his voice dropping to something low and direct, a register that had nothing to do with scheduling handyman appointments. She heard fragments, despite his discretion. She heard the words land trust and equity position and the Parkdale parcels, and once, clearly and without ambiguity, "I don't negotiate with people who threaten tenants." She filed it away. She was good at filing things away. What she had not prepared for was Ren. The girl was not unfriendly. She was watchful in the way of children who have learned that new situations require observation before investment. Kane. She was polite to Priya in the way of someone following a rule she agreed with, which was different from warmth but not its opposite. The evening that shifted something came 3 weeks in, on a Wednesday, when Tobias had a call that ran long, and Ren appeared in the kitchen doorway with her sketchbook and the look of someone who had been waiting for help, and decided Priya was the available option. "I have to draw 2 things that look the same but are actually different," Ren said. She sat down at the kitchen table and showed Priya her two examples. A drawing of pyrite beside real gold and two maple leaves from different species that were nearly identical. They look the same, Renson said, but they're not the same at all. Priya looked at the page. Then she looked at Ren, at the girl's careful measuring expression, and understood that the assignment was, in some way she couldn't fully articulate, also about her. "Tell me how you know the difference," Priya said, "between the ones that just look the same and the ones that actually are." Ren considered this with the full weight of her attention. "You have to pay attention," she said finally. "And you can't rush it." Priya stayed at that table for an hour after the assignment was finished, because for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was in a room where no one was performing and nothing was being sold. And the conversation meant exactly what it said. The signs she had been filing began accumulating. A dark SUV parked across the street 2 mornings in a row, angled with a clear sightline to the front door. The third morning it was gone, and Tobias left the house 40 minutes earlier than usual. One evening, Priya walked past the open door of the small back room he used as an office and saw his laptop screen before he closed it. Not quickly. He did not rush. He simply lowered the screen with the composure of someone accustomed to managing what others saw. But in the 2 seconds before he did, she registered what was on it. A satellite view of Toronto, overlaid with zoning boundaries and acquisition markers, spread across more than a dozen neighborhoods. Not the kind of map a handyman keeps. Then there was the park. It was a Saturday in November, June. Priya had taken Ren to High Park because Ren wanted to test whether Canada geese made decisions or simply reacted to stimuli, which required field observation and a notebook. Priya sat on a bench and watched the girl move carefully through the park with her sketchbook open and felt something she did not have a clean name for. Something adjacent to contentment. Something that made her uncomfortable precisely because it was uncomplicated. She was watching Ren crouch near a goose with her pencil ready when she became aware of 2 men near the park entrance. They wore good coats, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but can be recognized by someone who grew up surrounded by it. They were not looking at the park the way people who came to the park looked at it. They were looking at her. One of them walked toward her bench. He was polite in the way of people delivering a message they don't need to raise their voice to deliver. "Miss Anand," he said. "Or I suppose it's Mrs. Henning now. Your mother sends her regards. She also wanted you to understand that the decisions Anand Capital makes in the coming weeks will be significantly influenced by the choices you make in the coming days." Priya kept her expression level. She had been in rooms with men like this before. "I'm not sure what you think I can influence," she said. "Your husband," the man said, "has made things complicated for a number of people who have been patient. They'd like him to understand the patience has a limit." Ren was still across the field, sketchbook open, completely absorbed in her geese. Priya drew breath to respond when the man's attention shifted to a point behind her left shoulder, and something in his expression changed. Not fear exactly. The recalibration of someone who has realized they have made a significant error in their assessment of a situation. "We're done here." Tobias's voice came from behind her, low and absolutely without heat. He said 4 words to the man directly. She heard them clearly. "You know who I am." The man in the good coat looked at him for a long moment, then stepped back, said something quiet to his companion, and both of them left the park without looking back. Priya turned. Tobias was standing behind the bench in the jacket she'd seen him wear to school's pickups. He looked exactly as he always looked, but there was something in his posture she had not seen before, not aggression. Something older than that. The particular stillness of a person who has spent years being underestimated and learned to find it useful. Ren came running across the grass, sketchbook clutched to her chest. "The goose definitely makes decisions," she announced. "It chose the same bench 3 times. Tobias looked at his daughter, and the stillness in him softened at its edges. "Good data," he said. He did not look at Priya again until they were in the truck. Ren between them, the park receding through the rear window. Then, without drama, without apology, he told her everything. Caned. Henning Holdings had been incorporated 19 years ago when Tobias was 24 and working construction on a condo project in Liberty Village, whose financing structure he had studied closely enough to understand was broken and could be rebuilt at a fraction of the projected cost. He had done that restructuring. He had done it again with 4 more properties. He had done it quietly, consistently, and without placing his name anywhere prominent, because he had understood early that visible wealth attracted a different class of problem. He now held controlling interest in 37 commercial properties across the GTA. He held equity stakes in 14 residential development projects. He held more influence over the zoning and development landscape of Toronto's West End and parts of Hamilton than any single firm in Ontario. Influence he had used consistently and without exception to block the displacement of working-class communities in the path of commercial expansion. He had known who Priya Anand was the first day they met. He had known about Anand Capital's pending acquisition plan, a redevelopment project that would eliminate 900 residential units across 3 neighborhoods to build a mixed-use commercial corridor. He had been positioned to block it for 10 months. "You knew," Priya said. Her voice was steady. She was concentrating on keeping it that way. "From the beginning, yes," Tobias said. "And you still agreed to the marriage." "Yes, why?" Tobias kept his eyes on the road. "Because you were in a bad situation and you were trying to solve it with the tools you had. And because Ren needed stability. Both things were true at the same time." Priya sat with that in silence the rest of the drive home. She spent 2 days at a careful distance from him, maintained with the discipline of someone who had been managing her own emotional exposure since childhood. She was not angry, or she was, but she understood that the anger was not really about him. It was about the specific horror of realizing she had entered a situation with the confidence of someone making a calculated move and had in fact been, from the first minute, the least informed person in the room. She started with public records, city planning filings, nonprofit incorporation documents, land trust agreements going back 13 years. She pulled Henning Holdings' regulatory history, its zoning variance applications, its legal interventions against 4 separate displacement-driven development projects over the past decade. What she found did not look like a man who had married her for leverage. It looked like a man who had been doing the same thing quietly and without credit long before she had walked into a community center and introduced herself by her full name. The land trust structures Tobias had built protected residential tenants from exactly the kind of acquisition Anand Capital was now pursuing. He had funded the legal defense of tenant associations in 3 neighborhoods. He had bought buildings specifically to prevent their sale to developers who would have cleared them. He had done all of this under corporate entity names that did not include his own. The community workshop on Lansdowne Avenue had his fingerprints on its financing and the name of a small foundation on its dedication plaque. Not his name. A foundation named after his mother, who had raised him alone in one of the Parkdale apartments cleared for redevelopment when Tobias was 10, who had packed up a household that had been rooted in that block for 15 years and never quite found the same footing afterward. Tobias had never put his own name on any of it. He had put his mother's. Priya sat with that for a long time. Then she found the marriage contract, her own document. The one she had drafted and reviewed in 20 minutes and signed confident she understood every word. She had not understood all of it. There was a clause she had skimmed, legal language about asset protection in the event of dissolution, that she now read with the attention it had always deserved. Tobias had amended that clause before signing. His attorney had inserted language ensuring that in any divorce proceeding, Priya's personal assets remained entirely ring-fenced from any claim by his estate, his corporation, or any associated entity. He had also added a clause shielding her from reputational liability in connection with his business dealings. He had protected her legally before she had known she needed protecting. Before she had known there was anything to be protected from. Priya closed her laptop and sat in the stillness of his back office. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, she did not try to manage what she was feeling. She let it arrive fully. She had spent her entire adult life in rooms full of people who wanted something from her. Access to her name, her family's capital, her position inside a structure they couldn't enter on their own. She had become so skilled at identifying the want beneath every interaction that she had stopped being able to imagine a person who was simply present, simply paying attention without an agenda. Kane. She had looked at Tobias Henning and assumed the same thing she assumed everywhere, and he had been adjusting to her, but not the way she'd thought. He had adjusted by protecting her, by giving her space to make a real choice, without engineering the outcome toward himself, by refusing to defend himself against her suspicion, because he had already decided that anything she gave him had to come freely, or it wasn't worth having. That was not a man who had used her. That was a man who had been willing to lose her rather than manipulate her into staying. She found him in the kitchen early on a Thursday morning before Wren was awake, making coffee in his particular, unhurried way. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say and decided in the hallway that the rehearsal was itself the problem. "I want to void the contract," she said. Tobias turned from the counter. His expression was careful and still. "All right," he said, "not to end this, to end the version of this that was a transaction. I don't want to be here because of a document. I want to start from the actual beginning." He looked at her for a long moment, not calculating, weighing. She had learned to read the difference. "You did your research," he said. "It wasn't a question. I did what you would have done." Something shifted in his face. Small. Not quite a smile, but close to the place a smile comes from. "What did you find?" Someone who built the thing they believed in and put their mother's name on it instead of their own. Someone who amended a contract to protect a stranger before they'd had a second conversation. Tobias set down his coffee cup. "I knew who you were. I should have told you that earlier." "Yes," Priya said. "You should have, and I should have asked instead of filing it away and waiting for a problem to prove itself." She held his gaze. "We both have things we default to when we're not sure we can trust someone." "What do you want this to look like?" he asked. "Honest," she said. "Starting over, that's the whole list." It was not a romantic declaration. It was two people in a kitchen in the early morning agreeing plainly and directly to try. That was enough. It was, she thought, considerably more than enough. She called her mother that afternoon and asked to meet in person, not at the Anand Capital offices, not at the Forest Hill house. A restaurant on Ossington, neutral ground, the kind of place where neither of them had a home advantage. Vivian arrived first and was already seated when Priya came in. Her mother looked not older, exactly, but tired, in a way she rarely allowed to be visible. The tiredness of someone who has been waiting to see how something turns out and is no longer certain what outcome she is hoping for. Vivian had investigated Henning Holdings. She understood now what Tobias was. And being Vivian Anand, she had immediately translated that understanding into leverage. She laid it out for Priya with the clarity she brought to every negotiation. If Priya could bring Tobias to the table and persuade him to step back from his opposition to the redevelopment project, not surrender entirely, just negotiate a version Anand Capital could work with, Vivian would transfer operational control of the company to Priya 2 years ahead of schedule. Full autonomy. No more oversight. Everything Priya had asked for, on the terms she had always wanted, she said it as a gift. That was the part that made Priya's chest tighten. Her mother genuinely believed she was offering something generous. Priya looked at the table, then at her mother. "I'm not going to ask Tobias to step back from the redevelopment opposition," she said. "Not now, and not later. That's finished." Vivian was quiet. "I'm also staying married to him because I want to. Not as a tactic. Because of who he is and because of who I am when I'm in that house." Her mother was silent for longer than Priya had prepared for. She had expected argument, counteroffer, not silence. "When your father left," Vivian said, and the sentence itself was unusual enough that Priya went still, because her mother had not spoken about him in years. I decided the way I kept you safe was by controlling every outcome. I told myself that was love. That if I built the structure correctly, nothing would hurt you the way that did. Priya did not speak. What I understand now, her mother said slowly, is that what I built was a room you couldn't breathe in. She looked at her daughter with the expression of someone arriving at a place they have been approaching for a long time and are not sure how to enter. I need to think about how I do things differently. I don't know what that looks like yet. Neither do I, Priya said. For my part. Vivian nodded. She picked up her water glass and set it down, then, tell me about him, not the company. Him. It was the first question her mother had asked about Tobias that was not about leverage, liability, or strategic position. It was the first question about someone Priya loved that was simply about the person. Priya answered honestly, and they sat there for 2 hours, and nothing was resolved in the way resolutions look in stories where everything closes neatly. But something opened. A small door in the architecture, enough room for something different to eventually grow through. 3 weeks later, on a Friday evening in December, Wren chose the movie. She chose it with the gravity of someone who had researched her options. She had written 5 titles on a piece of notebook paper and ranked them by criteria she declined to fully explain, though it involved something she called the importance of the question being asked. The winner was a documentary about the Northern Lights filmed in Yukon. She announced this verdict and then went to get the popcorn bowl, which required the step stool and produced a small avalanche of microwave bags before she found the right one. They watched it on the living room floor. Wren, because the floor was her preferred viewing location, Priya, because Wren had sat beside her and the couch was farther away. Tobias, because the other two were on the floor. Somewhere around the 30-minute mark, Wren's commentary on the documentary became less frequent and then stopped entirely. Her head came to rest against Priya's arm. Her breathing slowed in the particular way of a child releasing the weight of consciousness for the night. The documentary continued. On screen, a scientist described charged particles from the sun colliding with Earth's atmosphere, energy that had traveled 150 million kilometers to arrive in the sky above Whitehorse on an ordinary Tuesday and turn it green. She argued with me for 20 minutes this morning, Tobias said quietly, about whether the popcorn should go in before or after the documentary starts. Who won? She did, he said. She always does. Priya looked at the side of his face, at the ease there, the particular piece of a man watching his daughter sleep. She thought about the records she had read, and the contract clause she had nearly missed, and the 4 words he had said in a park that made 2 men in good coats decide they had somewhere else to be, keen. She thought about the first day in the community center and the way she had sat down on a plastic chair to explain load distribution to a 7-year-old she had never met. She had thought, standing on the sidewalk outside City Hall with a ring that felt like a prop, that she was making a move in a game. She had thought she was the one running the plan. What she understood now was that she hadn't been running anything. She had been, for the first time in 32 years, simply moving towards something real without knowing it. The way water moves. Not because it plans to, but because the path opens and the direction is true. Tobias turned and found her looking at him. Neither of them said anything. The documentary continued. Wren slept with her sketchbook loosely held in one hand. One page turned to a drawing of a Canada goose with an arrow and a label that read Decision Point. Outside, December moved through the city. The green door at the front of the house held the cold out. Inside, nothing was perfect and nothing was finished, and everything, the trio of them on the floor, the light from the screen, the particular sound of a child breathing when she is completely safe, was exactly where it was supposed to be. Not because anyone had arranged it. Because they had chosen it. And that is where Priya's story ends. Not at an altar, not at a signing table, not in a boardroom. On a living room floor in a house that was never supposed to matter, with a family she was never supposed to want. 6 months later, the contract was long voided and the marriage was still standing, and Ren had started calling Priya by her first name instead of nothing at all, which was, in Ren's particular language, the equivalent of a declaration. Vivian came to dinner on a Sunday in March. She brought a plant for the porch and asked Ren about her goose research, and did not once mention zoning or acquisitions or strategic positioning. It was not perfect. It was a beginning. And that was enough. If this story landed somewhere in you, the part about performing a life someone else designed, or finally letting yourself trust what you actually feel, tell me which moment stayed with you. Was it the contract clause he quietly amended to protect her before she even knew she needed it? Or was it Ren asking the right question all along? You have to pay attention, and you can't rush it. And if you know someone like Tobias, someone who builds quietly and puts someone else's name on it, share this one. Those people deserve to be seen.